That little clicker thing? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank my hostesses for inviting me today. It's great to see some former colleagues and friends again, and just really happy to be here. It's a first for me, my first time in Montgomery, my first time in Alabama, and I thought that Nashville had hot weather, but Alabama has the heat beat, believe me. Well, this afternoon we are going to deviate a little bit from the chronological order of previous presentations by going back before the memorials. And perhaps the reason for that order was that sometimes talking about remains is not always good for the digestion. So in a way, it's probably a good thing that we're here talking about this afternoon at this time now. This is the first part of my book on repatriation and what exactly happened to the remains of the dead after the war and during the war. Now let's begin with a little recap here. I know we've talked about the statistics already by the previous speakers, but let's just repeat the figures of American war losses here because they were substantially less than those of other nations, as we've already pointed out. By 1919, British war dead numbered over 700,000, and France, of course, lost well over 1 million men, while the U.S. had less than 117,000 war dead. And of course, this total represents a lot of deaths from illness, from flu, and other non-combat fatalities. It also includes the missing and those lost at sea. Now, the months following the signing of the armistice in 1918 brought an increased awareness of the extent of death and destruction that was caused by the war, and nowhere was this devastation more apparent than across the Western Front, in Belgium and in northern France. And while politicians debated reparations and the future League of Nations, armies buried their dead and counted the cost of victory or defeat. The painful reconstruction process had begun. Allied efforts to sanitize the former fields of carnage began with the consolidation of cemeteries once peace was declared. The American Graves Registration Service, or what I'll refer to as the GRS, was largely responsible for the work of identifying, exhuming, and registering bodies that were left in burials in more than 2,400 different sites, imagine it, across Europe where American dead were temporarily buried. Now we're going to take a look at how we get from these former battlefields to this, America's post-war commemorative landscape overseas. Americans were confident that, as in past wars, their dead would be returned home for burial. And this belief became further entrenched when in September 1918, Secretary of War Newton Baker publicly pledged to the nation that the government would ensure a home burial to all who died in their foreign service. Prior to this, General Pershing and the U.S. Army's Quartermaster General had agreed that it was, quote, impracticable to use valuable shipping space for coffins and burial equipment, and so it was decided that Americans who died in Europe would be interred there, and no attempt would be made to bring them back until after the cessation of hostilities. But the passing of 2 unprecedented years of modern warfare, occurring thousands of miles from American shores, and the extent of casualties, and the shifting trends of public opinion, all undoubtedly combined to make the disposition of bodies probably an issue worth reconsidering. Baker's promise, which was made in lieu of any clear policy concerning the deceased, was announced in newspapers that autumn, and it would take the place of any sort of policy that should have been decided by the government, and it would also place the government in an awkward position once peace was declared. So for months after the U.S. entered the War Department was bombarded with inquiries from relatives of soldiers killed overseas, and still there was no official policy. So with the ceasefire, you can imagine impatient pleas began arriving at the War Department in an unprecedented pace, with families clamoring for the return of their war dead. But the government's response was the same to all of them. Quote, "When permitted, the bodies will be returned to the U.S. and shipped to their families for interment at public expense." End of quote. So to lead this mighty challenge, Chaplain Charles C. Pierce was recalled to active duty, appointed to the rank of major, and he was assigned as the commander of this fledgling GRS outfit based in Tours, France. He had retired in 1908 after serving on the American frontier, and also he headed up the U.S. Army morgue in Manila. But with the expedient decision to recall Pierce out of retirement, he brought with him the burial practices and policies of another era, and in a way that really perpetuated those practices into a new kind of warfare, which would create many problems for the Americans. For over 1 year after the armistice, the War Department still had no policy in place for the disposition of buried soldiers' remains across Europe. It's hard to believe. But meanwhile, the impassioned debate raged across America as to whether or not it was best to leave the deceased buried overseas or to bring them home for burial. So the Army was equally unprepared, and initially they recommended a civilian burial corps be appointed, while some in Congress recommended that the American Red Cross be responsible for this. But in early 1919, a decree by the French government provided a convenient opportunity for the War Department to buy more time to create their strategy. And their policy was that all exhumations and transport of bodies would be prohibited for 3 years. The lack of transportation and hygiene dangers were cited as justification for delaying any further removals. Americans were appalled that the French would disapprove of the immediate and complete removal of bodies from all regions of the battlefields. However, evidence indicates that their indignation and their impatience was really misplaced, and it should have been directed at the higher echelon of the U.S. military, who worked behind the scenes in collaboration with the French ministry to stall for times until they could figure out a practical strategy. France wasn't the only nation, though, that was affected by American intentions to repatriate the dead. In Brussels, the, quote, insistent demands of the U.S. government for the removal of soldiers' remains buried there was said to be causing them considerable embarrassment. People from other nations also wanted their dead brought home. So poor newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Pierce met regularly with the French officials throughout early 1919 to discuss the ban on the removal of the deceased. He understood their views, and he wrote to Pershing, explaining to him, quote, should an exception be made in the case of the American dead, it would at once involve each of the other nations in clamorous agitation for like action to satisfy its own people, unquote. France would become a charnel house, he explained, if the U.S. proceeded with its plans for removals. On behalf of the French, Pierce pleaded that such ghastliness be avoided. So following a congressional visit overseas in mid-1919, it was hoped that the American public would be persuaded to leave their dead over in France in newly created cemeteries. The U.S. Senate appropriated $500,000 for the establishment of a national cemetery in France. At this point, their plans are still, in the early stages. At home, the American people continued to debate this hotly contested issue until March 1919, when the War Department opted for what they believed was a truly democratic response, I guess it was, by sending out 75,000 ballots to families, presenting them with three distinct options. One, the government would return remains to families for a local burial in the choice city or state, wherever families chose. Two, the government would return the remains for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Or number three, which is the one the government hoped they opted for, leave the dead buried overseas to be placed in permanently new national cemeteries in Europe. But they didn't specify where those would be. So by January 1920, an overwhelming majority had responded to the War Department's ballot, with over 63,000 people asking that their loved ones be returned as soon as possible. So in anticipation of this action, Congress once again allocated money, this time $5 million, authorizing Secretary Baker to make arrangements to build these cemeteries. And by spring 1920, permission was finally granted to begin the repatriation process. Now, by contrast, neither Belgium nor the United Kingdom and her dominions repatriated their war dead. Despite determined pleas and the angry demands of the British people, instead, British policy called for the establishment of a cemetery anywhere 40-plus bodies were buried, resulting in the creation of over 1,500 British cemeteries. Burial parties of various nations would have all experienced the same macabre disinterment process as they endured January's scenes of severe frost, followed by muddy thaws. And as Field Marshal Douglas Haig described, shell craters full of water, mud, and tangled belts of barbed wire render it difficult to find graves which are known to exist, and the ground has to be carefully searched to discover others which we know are registered. It involves the great labor of opening graves and removing bodies and moving them for varying distances of up to 3 miles. It's a task repugnant to both the personnel employed on it and to the relatives who have to imagine it. But except in the chalky soil in the country north of the Somme, a few months after burial, it's enough to reduce the body to a skeleton because the soil is so chalky. So the transportation of the dead across France was another logistical dilemma, and it required a generous allowance of trucks, canal boats, railway cars, and administratively requests from the next of kin had to be matched with the bodies, which were buried in hundreds of different sites. And even the logistics had to all be worked out as to how they were going to do all this because things changed continuously. For General Pershing's army, more than 6,000 African American soldiers were detailed to the GRS to perform the gruesome reburial work. And the way they did it was that 20 men would form a skirmish line at intervals of 50 meters. And in this fashion, these troops could cover an average of 64 square kilometers per day. Troops, mostly labor battalions, appointed to this task considered it to be the worst job of all the services of supply assignments. They lived in permanent housing without any modern conveniences, and they often endured the unpleasant weather while they performed their grisly duty. And the black laborers found and reburied, though, at least 23,000 bodies near the Meuse River in the Argonne forest. But the digging and the burying would go on for years. It became clear in March 1920 that at least 70,000% of the dead would have to be returned from abroad. But there were delays due to a lack of caskets and coffins. There were restrictions on railway use in France. There were problems obtaining local labor. And there was a lack of serviceable trucks, too, just to name a few of the issues that they encountered. Like that. The post-war concentration of dead was itself a process prone to confusion and chaos, as bodies were often exhumed several times and then relocated miles from their original burial place, as I've stated. before finally being laid to rest in the National Cemetery once that was decided. Many were moved again to another cemetery, often in the U.S. at the request of kin, who seldom had any idea how many times they'd already been moved, the body had already been moved. For example, one Philadelphia mother, who was the mother of 3 sons, who had all volunteered for service overseas, wrote to the War Department, and she asked where her sons' names would appear at the new cemetery in France. She said, "I am a mother of the unknown. My son, Sergeant Winfred A. Jackson, was buried 3 times and then lost." Sadly, her son had been first a victim of enemy fire, then a bureaucracy that, although it was well-intentioned, was not equipped to deal with the ever-changing demands forced upon it. The weight that this sacred burden of choice represented to many families is apparent from the steady stream of cables that dispatches went back and forth between Paris and Washington, D.C., when by 1921, thousands of families had changed their minds regarding the final disposition of their deceased. Imagine it. Many feared that the body they received would not be the right one, and in some cases it wasn't. But once resolved, the agonizing wait for the body's return, once they made their decision, it could often take years before they would finally receive the remains. But for those who chose an overseas burial, there would be no family funeral service, no headstone in a local cemetery, nothing left to venerate, no apparent closure so necessary for that grieving process. And for the families of those who were officially missing or unknown, time seldom offered any solace or resolution. These families would receive no headstone, no photograph, and eventually only a name that would be carved in a memorial wall, probably in a chapel in a cemetery. My feeling is that repatriation of the dead eventually diluted the memory of the war dead. It proved enormously costly and divisive, and concern over the decisions made by families often left doubts that lingered after the daunting choice was made. Close to 25,000 families made the decision to leave the deceased loved ones buried overseas in new national World War I cemeteries. And this resulted in most of America's war dead being buried in scattered graves throughout the United States. And so as a result, the interest in overseas commemoration was fairly diluted because they had their bodies back and they were, again, scattered throughout the United States. So all the unknown were left buried overseas except for the unknown soldier, the one unknown soldier, who was returned from France and buried at Arlington in 1921. Despite this seeming simplicity, though, of Secretary Baker's pledge, it triggered a massive and highly controversial repatriation of the war dead from the battlefields in Europe to the U.S. between 1919 and 1922. But neither the U.S. nor any other nation up until that time had ever attempted such a colossal, expensive task, one that would set an enduring national precedence for generations. Today, we have 5 cemeteries, World War I cemeteries in France, 1 in England, 1 in Belgium, and we have 3 large monuments and several smaller ones to scale throughout France. Thank you for your time and your attention.